Hello and welcome to the official kickoff of the Local Writers Read 2020 season with our first event on the theme Dramatic Entrances. For those who are familiar with the season, obviously we look a little different this year. With the pandemic and the shutdowns, we've shifted to live streaming our events, which has its benefit because now lots of people can see us right from the comfort of your own home. So we welcome you all. I am Josh Gauthier. I'm a librarian, writer, playwright, and eclectic other things from time to time, and one of the co-organizers of Local Writers Read. I have with me Jenny O'Connell, who is one of our first readers. And so before we kick off with the event tonight, I just want to say a couple things. As we've shifted to the digital format, we've rolled out a brand new website. We've rolled out our YouTube channel where you will be able to view these videos after the conclusion of the event. So check us out. We're always happy to hear from anybody. And also, I want to give a shout out to Courtney and Quiet City Books. Quiet City is our favorite local bookstore in Lewiston. And normally we would host our events there, but as we've shifted to online, obviously we can't do that for the time being. But please do check out Quiet City online, chat with Courtney about books, order some things from her. She's fantastic and has been a great supporter of the arts. And she will be on later this evening to discuss the pieces a little bit after we read. Okay, so our theme for this first reading is dramatic entrances. Think of explosions and car chases, think of dramatic stories, and even quiet moments of just people who stick in your mind and stay with you on the movie, after the page, whatever it is. And so we've got 5 readers over the course of this weekend, really kind of playing with that theme and just looking at it in very different ways across genres and styles. So to introduce our guest for tonight, Jenny O'Connell's debut book project, Finding Petronella, chases her 2014 solo trek across Finland, following in the footsteps of a female legend into the heart of the Arctic Circle. A Maine Literary Award finalist and Pushcart Prize nominee, her writing has appeared in creative nonfiction, Slice, Maine Magazine, and literary magazines across the country. Jenny teaches creative writing in Portland and guides wilderness expeditions in Maine and abroad. And you can find her online at jenniferaoconnell.com. And we'll be hearing from Jenny very shortly. Her book is phenomenal, and so you all are in for a treat with that reading. Before we get to that point, you get to hear from me. And I have been working on a fantasy adventure novella, which is forthcoming this year, about a snarky battle unicorn and a violence-weary gunslinger on the run and taking a missing persons case in an expansive swamp. So we'll get right to it. I'm going to read a couple scenes from the opening of this novella, and then we'll go from there. So this is the beginning of Land of Outcasts. The servants in Duke Fabar's manor knew that in order to keep to their rooms signified the imminent arrival of a visitor they were better off remaining as unaware of as possible, assuming that they valued their freedom and their lives. Because these particular servants, the ones not imprisoned or vanished in the dead of night, did indeed value their ability to continue drawing breath, there was no one to mark the dark shadow of a man passing through the manor, like the chill that shivers down the back of your spine without warning. The man in black followed servants' passages between the walls, working toward the receiving room at the manor's center. He walked on noiseless feet and wrapped himself in shadows that concealed the weapons strapped across his body. With a face as inscrutable as an open grave, he pushed aside a painting to step into the receiving room. Coals glowed from the grate, shining dim orange light into the otherwise dark room. The space would have been ornate with half the adornment, and it would have been stylish if someone with sense and restraint had been allowed to oversee its design. As it was, The visual affront of the room stirred distaste or alarm in those who encountered it for the first time. It suited Duke Fabar perfectly. As the man in black crossed a thick carpet which should have been deemed illegal for its excess, the only sound was the soft clink of fine china from the high-backed chair near the fireplace. The Duke jolted when he looked up to discover his guest standing within reach of his elbow. His squeak of a voice quieted as he recognized the other man. "Oh, Nix, you're here." The pale of fear did not leave the Duke's face, even as he schooled himself back into a semblance of composure. The man, called Nix, made no comment on the Duke's demeanor. When he spoke, his voice was low, like thunder in the distance. "You have need of me?" Fabar set aside his mug and saucer, the better to conceal the slight tremble in his hand. Yes, I have a job for you. I believe you know a pair of mercenaries named Eli and Sasha." A faint grin curled the edges of Nix's mouth. "I do." "Well, they've recently assaulted a caravan of goods I was transporting. They massacred my guards, left them strewn over the mountain pass. The shipment was lost, and that damned pair have run off with my money. I want you to bring them to me. Dead would be acceptable." Nix heard the exaggeration in the Duke's story. The lie would have been clear even if Nix hadn't been familiar with his new targets. But, and here Nix reached for a desperate hope, perhaps Eli had finally overstepped. Perhaps Nix's long-awaited opportunity had arrived. He did not let the thrill of this possibility show on his face. There was another matter to be dealt with first. Nix did not like being lied to. "My usual rate?" he asked. "Plus an extra 100, since the targets are obviously dangerous if they've carried out such a massacre." The Duke's expression tightened, but he reined in his annoyance at the haggling. "Plus a bonus for swift completion," he added instead. Clearly, this was a matter the Duke wished brought to a rapid conclusion, if he was being so free with his money. "I have already issued a general bounty," he continued, "but I have little faith in the usual sellswords." "Do you know where they are now?" "My spies claim they are fleeing south." "If they're on the run, I expect they're making for the green." Fabar grimaced. "Where all the scum and miscreants end up. Will that be a problem?" "Not at all. I will report back when it's done." The Duke never enjoyed these little encounters. People like Nix were like weapons, better kept at a distance and handled by other people. But this situation required a personal touch. He blinked when he realized that the mercenary was no longer standing beside him. The man tended to do that, appearing and vanishing without warning. Settling back into his chair, he listened carefully for the sound of the painting being shut. When no sound came, he leaned around to look. The portrait hung in its usual position, and there was no sign that Nix had ever existed. Alone in the dark, Duke Fabar shivered. He retrieved his tea from the side table and willed it to stop shaking. Soon, this would all just be an unpleasant memory. Now we're going to jump ahead a little bit. On a humid day, so thick you could almost swim through the air, a man walked along the wooden causeway toward the small town of Harmon's Folly. Meanwhile, the great black horse walking beside him, which was not actually a horse at all, was a creature unlike any ever before seen in lands so far south. At 18 hands, she stood taller than an average man. The horse that was not a horse had shaggy black hair matted with burrs and sticks. Mud was tangled in her mane and tail, and her saddlebags had grown loose, leaning awkwardly to one side. But the horse's most notable feature, the thing anyone with eyes would notice first, was the black horn jutting from the center of her head, marking her not as a horse at all, but as a unicorn. "Tell me again why you've dragged us down here?" asked the unicorn in a voice that was undeniably female, but also low and rough, carrying little warmth. The man took a deep breath of putrid air and held back a gag. Warm temperatures, beautiful scenery, abundant opportunity. What's not to like? The unicorn turned her head from the endless swamplands to the 5-foot lizard hissing at them from a nearby branch. You're right, Eli, she drawled. This is obviously the most beautiful place I've ever seen. Thank you for bringing me here. Eli inclined his head as though the thanks were sincere. You're welcome. The unicorn snorted, closing her eyes slowly before speaking again. Back home, I had an ancient forest that whispered secrets in the dead of night. I had spreading grasslands where I could run for hours. Wide battlefields where enemies cowered before me, and we've given it all up for this. We gave it all up because we made a powerful man quite angry. I won't speak for you, but I'm rather partial to breathing, Eli said with a smile. Besides, I think it's beautiful. The unicorn fixed one golden eye on him. Your neck is bleeding from a nasty-looking bite. You have sweat soaking through your jacket, and there are a pair of eyes watching us from the water, just down there. I expect the creature attached to them is more than ready to eat us if the opportunity arises. She sniffed. Well, you, at least. Eli sighed. Sasha, really, can't you just enjoy the moment? He spread his arms, turning in a circle to take in the view. When will we ever see a place like this again? It was only a flash in the dim light, but something lunged at the tail of his coat as it flared beyond the edge of the walkway. Eli leapt away to the sound of a growl and a splash that spent muddy water spilling across the bridge. Sasha laughed. Well, maybe this trip will be good for a little entertainment, if nothing else. So long as it's brief. We aren't staying, right? His breathing shaky in the immediate aftermath of nearly being eaten, Eli tugged his hat lower, his composure settling back into place almost immediately. He straightened his coat and the 2 flintlock pistols secured beneath, and resumed walking down the causeway without answering. Wait, Eli, we aren't staying. Eli! The unicorn followed at an anxious trot while her metal shoes left gouges in the rotting planks of the walkway down the path to Harmon's Folly. And so thus introduces 3 of the principal characters of Land of Outcasts. I hope you enjoyed. We'll be going to Jenny in just a moment. Before we do, I just wanted to say quickly, I am monitoring the comments on our Facebook live stream here. And we will have some time at the end for a little bit of question and answer and discussion. So feel free to leave comments and questions there, and we'll try to get to a few of those as we have time afterwards in our discussion. And now, without further ado, please welcome Jenny O'Connell.
Thank you. It's so great to be here, and it's especially special for me because Josh and I went to Stone Coast MFA together. We were classmates getting our creative writing degrees in different fields. I write creative nonfiction, which you'll read in just a moment, but I'm just so honored to be here next to Josh, who is, I don't think he read his bio, but he is a playwright and a pop fiction writer and such a talented master of imagination, and I always enjoy listening to what he has to read. So thank you so much, Josh. And
thank you.
Yeah, love that entrance. And thank you. I am so thrilled to be reading this chapter. I wrote the chapter I'm about to read. This is the year of the book, and I have been working. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a moment. But I wrote it this week. So in the name of imperfection, I'm excited to share this with you tonight. Before I whisk us away to another corner of the world, I wanted to take a moment to honor what's happening here in America in the fight for Black lives, and encourage you all to read Voices of Color. That is a promise I've made to myself, especially for this summer. And there's so much amazing work out there. One that's near to my heart is a youth series run by a literary nonprofit that I work at called The Telling Room out of Portland, who have they're just an incredible organization in general, but they just started a a series that particularly showcases local Black and Brown student voices from Portland, Maine, responding to the moment. And I'm just really excited to read youth voices as well as the adults out there. So thank you. I will share that link actually in the comments maybe, or I'll send it to Josh in the chat and he can. I'm not good at technology, but
we'll get it posted after the stream in the comments here.
Perfect, thank you. Well, the excerpt I'm reading tonight is from my book in progress, which is called Finding Petronella, and it traces my 2014 solo trek across Finland in the footsteps of a female legend named Petronella Vandermoor. So before I read, it takes a moment of catching up to where we are, because the excerpt I'm going to read comes from the middle of the book. So in June of 1949, right after World War II, Petronella Vandermoor sailed to Finland. She was 26 and she wanted to be a writer. And she had a really curious and charming personality. She had a lot of thrilling stories of adventure in her time in the Dutch resistance. And she befriended the rich and elite in Helsinki until she ran out of money and ditched her hotel bills and fled the police up north to Lapland. On the way to Finnish Lapland, she met a man named Klaus Seinäjärvi, who was a geologist who was headed into Lapland's gold rush. And she and Klaus walked 110 kilometers through the wilderness to the gold fields, where she ended up staying and living and working and becoming dear friends with the gold miners there, until the secret police caught up to her and arrested her months later. So she was deported. She had a trial in Helsinki and she was deported on a ship to Copenhagen, and then she disappeared. So for 65 years, people were searching for her, the gold miners, the press, and over time, she became a legend up in Lapland. So she is the subject of many books. There's Petronella the musical in Oulu, Finland. She's the name of a street in Inari. She's a restaurant, she's a song. There's 2 hills in Lemmenjoki National Park, which is the modern day national park that was where the gold rush was going on and where she lived, that are named after her breasts, which is gold miner humor. And the modern gold miners still tell her stories. So more than 70 years later, she continues to be a figure of mystery and renown. In 2013, when I was living in California, I brought over a quiche and a bottle of wine for my neighbor Solange, who was caring for her mother who had dementia. Her mother was 89 years old. And upon meeting her mother, the first lucid thing she said to me was, I walked to Lapland. And it was Petronella. I had met her. Of course, I didn't know the story then, but her words caught me. I was also 26, and though I had been building a career as an outdoor guide, I also wanted to be a writer. I really wanted to be a writer. I just taken my first writing class and it had lit this fire in me. And the more I found out about her story, the more I knew I needed to go. I should probably mention that I left that night thinking that Petronella had actually walked across Finland, which she didn't. But the resources about her were in Finnish and Dutch, and so it took me a while to figure that out. So I tried to walk and hitchhike across Finland. But it's crazy because almost 6 years ago to the day, I left my job and community in California and boarded a plane with my backpack and flew to Helsinki to begin a long journey north. So this scene in the book, in the name of dramatic entrances, is when I have been walking and hitchhiking north for a month, over 800 kilometers, and have just arrived at Lemmenjoki River for the first time. I'm about to meet the gold miners. At the beginning of my journey, I received an invitation to a private festival in Lemmenjoki, which came with these directions. Cross the Arctic Circle, take a bus 5 hours north of Rovaniemi to the town of Ivalo, transfer in Ivalo and get off at the grocery store in the even smaller town of Inari, wait there for the mail taxi and ask the mailman for a ride to Nurgalati Bay, which is 46 kilometers away, and then find a boat driver who will take you 25 kilometers upriver to Kultahamina, also called Gold Harbor in English. With a map and a compass, walk 12 kilometers into the wilderness to a gold claim called Pekosinkuru. So I've just done most of that. I've arrived at the riverbank, and I'm now I have to figure out how to get myself upriver and into Pekosinkuru. The one other thing that you should know is at this point, it was a kind of a low point. I'd gotten Lyme's disease from a tick in southern Finland, and my tent leaks. My confidence was shot because I had met with a reporter in Helsinki who had showed up at Petronella and Solange's house. And Solange is very private, and she had planned her, Petronella died just before I left for Finland, and Solange had planned to bring her mother's ashes back to the fells in Lemmenjoki, where she lived with her beloved gold miners. And so the reporter's visit to her house threw this all into question. So I've just made it to the Lemmenjoki River. Now I will show you the most beautiful river in the world, said the boat driver as he ripped the engine cord, and he laughed, but he meant it. His name was Tinti, he told us, after a small bird or a certain kind of salmon. And as he pointed the Nuoli 7 upriver and gunned the engine, perched lightly in the stern with his hand on the throttle, I thought I could see why. The red wooden boat rode low in the water. There were only 6 passengers, including me, but alongside our luggage, musical instruments had been stuffed into every inch of space. A snare drum, an accordion, a trumpet, a bouzouki, and wedged into the bow, an upright bass. I'd made it just in time to ride in with the band. We sat on the hard benches in silence as Lemmenjoki entered us, granite and water, blue sky stippled with clouds. Reindeer on the low banks flicked their tails and fled into the old-growth pine forest as we passed. The air smelled dark and sweet, like moss and river water. Cool spray kicked up by the boat settled on our faces. We stopped once to shed our neon orange life preservers for a hike into Ravadas Kongas, a stout white waterfall that rolled toward the river, and again to walk the steep trail where the channel became too shallow to pass. Tinti expertly guided the boat through a minefield of rocks, cutting the engine at just the right places and speeding through the V made by the narrowing of the river. You drive your boat like art, I said to him when we climbed back in. It's like you know every rock, every riffle. Every rock knows me, Tinti answered. Farther upriver, the canyon walls grew high around us, granite cliffs cloaked in Scotch pine. Just out of sight beyond those pines, I knew, rose the high rolling fells of Lemmenjoki, a place at last with contour lines. I leaned back with my hand on the gunwale, and for a short time I forgot to be afraid. But then we rounded a bend and I saw the rickety wooden dock nestled in among the reeds. Kultahamina, Gold Harbor. Fear gripped my belly with hot fingers. This was the moment I'd both wanted and dreaded. If there was one place in Finland I could find Petronella's ghost, Lemmenjoki was it. But I had paid a price to get here. The media attention I'd accidentally brought down on Solange had potentially destroyed our friendship. Now she, for all I knew, would not be coming next week. I had failed to bring the gold miners the one thing they wanted, Petronella. There were no ashes, no daughter, just me. Tinti nosed the boat through the reeds and I shrunk away from the dock. All these days of trudging along the highway shoulder, the fitful nights of sleep in public parks, the Lyme disease racking my body, the ravaging moments of loneliness. I had traveled over 1,000 kilometers. For what? I was an imposter grasping at a legend. Surely the gold miners would see through me. I'd met Petronella twice, and I'd been trying to emulate her spirit without really understanding who she was. All I knew was how her words had made me feel, buzzing and alive, like I had stumbled on a map to myself. I walked to Lapland, she said. If the gold miners turned me away, I would fail beyond all recovery. A rumble from up in the pines. 3 men rolled down the hill, knees on the seats of their ATVs as they revved toward us. With grizzly beards and bare forearms, wearing heavy boots and leather work gloves, they looked as if they could have stepped straight out of a lumberjack magazine. I noticed the band was staring too. Tinty stepped out of the boat and tied it swiftly to the dock. There was a flurry of activity as the gold miners loaded the base into a bucket trailer and began strapping instruments and luggage onto their ATVs. Aware that I was not actually with the band, that there was no room promised for me, I got out of the boat, pulling my backpack with me, and tucked my compass into my jacket pocket. I didn't really know how to use it. In my years of outdoor guiding, that was one skill that had eluded me. But Aki had said I would need to walk 12 kilometers to somewhere called Pekosenkuru, and I wasn't about to impose myself on these men. I see you made it. A man in a faded red t-shirt and jeans stood in front of me. His glasses made his brown eyes, already enormous, even more so. Aki. Yes, I said, and then quickly, lest he think I was expecting a ride, I can walk. Aki took his hand out of his leather work glove and held it out to me. When he smiled, it broke across his whole face. Welcome to Lemmenjoki, was all he said. After a month of almost no physical contact, the warmth of another human body felt divine. I held tight to a gold miner named Ilka as he throttled his ATV up the aptly named Heart Attack Hill. Dappled sunlight slid over us as we wound through flaky gray and red trunks that grew thin and close together, erupting at the top into crooked branches of blue-green needles. Ilka killed the engine next to a small stream that flowed under a wooden bridge. A hulking figure with a long green coat and formidable leather belt fastened below his belly, he had a kind, trembling smile. He removed a small plastic cup from his belt, a kuksa he called it, and bent to dip it in the stream. Ilka drained the water from the cup and smacked his lips together. I never come past this stream without stopping to drink, he said. He filled the cup again and passed it to me. I looked at it in terror, thinking only of Giardia. Go ahead, he said. I parted my lips and took a tiny sip, knowing that one can get Giardia, a parasite that lives in contaminated water, from even the smallest drop. And I held the water in my mouth, waiting for Ilka to turn around so I could spit it out. But he just grinned and watched me expectantly. I swallowed. The water tasted sweet and cold. Silently apologizing to my gut for what might happen later, I downed the whole cup. As we rose in elevation, Ilka took great pride in pointing out the ancient, gnarled Eiche pine trees. They seem small, but that one is over 1,000 years old, he said. That one is probably 2,000. He was a newcomer to the goldfields himself, just entering his second season, and I'd later find out that he had a knack for exaggeration. The oldest tree in Lemmenjoki is about 500 years old, 800 tops. Ilka was trying to impress upon me the magnitude of the landscape. Don't feed her, he'd tell the other gold miners later in private. She needs to understand how hard it is. But I didn't need Ilka to tell me that. For more than half of every year, this place was buried in snow and ice, with temperatures plummeting below my wildest imagination. A new definition of cold. I could see it now in the way the whole place vibrated with a sort of energy. When the ground thawed each year, the trees and animals became violently alive. These pines were miraculous. They had survived. Then, down a dip in the path and up a sharp rocky outcropping, Morgamoya, the claim where Petronella had lived. Ilka said the name softly and stopped his ATV. I knew we were on our way somewhere and I wasn't supposed to get off, but I twisted in my seat, straining to see through the dust curling around us, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. A small wooden cabin set up on the hill with long stalks of magenta fireweed tapping against its windows. I tried to imagine her walking up the trail next to the stream for the first time, the way her skirt must have opened to the breeze, the tiny shoes on her swollen and blistered feet. I carried a black and white photograph in my backpack of Petronella at Morgamoya, her sleeves rolled up, one hand on the sauna door. She was almost smiling. Ilka started up the engine again, and we continued upward, over rocks and tangled root systems that cut into the dusty ATV track. Bumps appeared in the hillside like waves, and we rode them, always climbing, Scotch pine giving way to silver birch and low shrubs, up and up, until we burst from the tree cover and out onto bare open fells. I turned sharply around, and behind me was Morgamvibus, the highest mountain in Lemmenjoki, massive and bald. Ilka pointed out Petronella Hills to our left, twin ridges named after her breasts. Next, we came upon a machine mine, a great yellow scar ripped onto the landscape by excavators. Piles of sand loomed next to a thin river, which had been dug out and diverted. I stared at it. I had been teaching environmental education for 5 years, and I did not know how I felt about mining, even the small private kind. This, just one more reason for the gold miners to reject me. After a number of twists and turns that I was sure I would have missed if left to my own devices, we arrived at Pecos I took a deep, huge gulp of open air. The festival started before it officially began, that evening with the band. They were a Balkan jazz band, a loose, fun group of guys who would later hit it big, but nobody knew it then. All we knew was that they could play. The bassist bobbed his head as he plucked his upright. The drummer played a single snare with a brush. The accordion player, who was from the north, swayed back and forth as he toggled between major and minor keys. The trumpet player was the most lively of all. He'd wail a solo and then set his trumpet down and snatch me up to dance. They played Finnish tango. They played humpa, a fast, jazzy two-step. And in the middle of it all was Jaakko Laitinen, the man the band was named for, crooning in his dulcet baritone, his arms thrown open wide. If we hadn't been swatting mosquitoes and crunching our shoes to the beat in the dirt, you'd have never known by what the band wore that we were 160 kilometers from anywhere. Clad in suit jackets and button-down shirts, leather belts and shiny shoes, they played with all the class you might see in a Helsinki jazz club, but with a mischievous, manic energy, as if they were breaking some sort of rule. This wasn't even the party. The real party was tomorrow, when over 50 gold miners would be coming in from all over Lemmenjoki. Maybe it was the way these fine, glossy instruments had suddenly appeared in this most wild of places, how their sound tangled in the scrub and evaporated into the air above our heads. Maybe it was the simple fact of our arrival. Whatever it was, we were all rapturous with delight. The small group of us, Aki, Ilka, a gold miner named Yuka who owned Pekos and Kuru, and Tuti, the only woman I'd seen so far, stood clutching plastic cups of wine in our hands and looked out at the hills rolling away from us toward Norway, reindeer lichen and crowberries as far as we could see. It wasn't that there was an absence of trees, just that the few twisted Ike pines were dwarfed by the wide open sky. It was this sky that so held me. It felt as if my whole journey, all the unanswered questions, all the days of walking and hitchhiking and struggling up the highway shoulder had led me to this sky over Lemmenjoki, and here there was room for it all. I leaned against the picnic table where Ilka and Tuti sat smoking a cigarette. Both of their faces were flushed with wine and chill air. Ilka beamed at me. A mosquito landed on his eyelid, and without thinking, I reached to brush it away. It was such a familiar gesture, like one a friend might make. How swiftly the Finnish rules of conduct had shifted. Minä kulta, Ilka said, which was what the gold men called Petronella, my dear. He raised his plastic cup in my direction. Our own Petronella. Tuti met my eyes. She had a timid smile and a full throaty laugh, and she carried herself easily among the gold men, snapping photos with her camera and cracking quiet jokes. We'd only exchanged a handful of words in the last few hours, but I felt drawn to her. She's not Petronella, Tuti said. She said it to Ilka, though she was looking straight at me. She's Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. I've heard, I think, a few different pieces of this story now, and every time I do, it's so delightful how you tell it, but then it's such an incredible story, I think, for you and for Petronella, and so to weave those together, I love listening to it. So
thank you.
Okay, so we're going to bring in a couple other people right now to join in for the Q&A and discussion a little bit. While they are logging on, we have a few different questions in the chat, but I'm going to pull one to start with. So Jenny, Megan in the chat says, now I'm curious, what was the first non-lucid thing Petronella said to you?
Oh, I think it was just like, hello. Yeah, we shook hands in the beginning, but she was quiet. They were having dinner. And so by the time that I had like really arrived in the room and we had sat there, yeah, she told me about her Lapland story.
Okay, so we are joined by Claire, who is my co-organizer for Local Writers Read, and Courtney, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the owner of Quiet City Books. So we're gonna go through, we're just gonna, we'll answer some of the questions from the chat. We'll have a little bit of discussion amongst ourselves. And then we will be wrapped up by about 7 at the latest. So Claire, I know you had a question or two. Do you want to start us off?
Are you hearing something from my computer? I'm sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback and weirdness, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to.
You sound
I'm gonna have to log off, guys. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I can't. Yeah, sorry, my connection is bad.
We'll come back to you.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll jump to another question. So Jenny Jefferson in the chat is wondering, how does your life as a wilderness guide interact with your life as a writer? Do they influence each other? Do they conflict at all?
That's a great question. Both of those things are true, actually. A lot of what I write is inspired by the outdoors, and specifically being a woman in an outdoor profession. In the beginning of my outdoor career, a lot of my role models were men. And so a lot of my work revolves around kind of the intersection of feminism and wilderness and adventure and risk. I'm a big proponent of healthy, empowered risk taking. So I think my outdoor life has definitely informed that part of my writing, where I teach in my outdoor career. I teach mostly youth, but some adults as well, to take positive risks and to push themselves beyond their limits in certain ways, but ways that are also safe and empowered. And so that's what a lot of my work is about. And on the flip side, I used to be like 80% outdoor guide, 20% writer when I first started, and then it kind of came to the middle, and now it's more like this. So I still do guide. I'm a Maine whitewater guide, and which I didn't guide at all last season, and who knows about this season. So I miss it a lot. I spend a lot of my time behind a computer now, but whenever I can get out, I do, and it always makes me feel alive, which I feel like is a really important feeling for me to tap into when I write.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Yeah, yes. How about a dramatic entrance, right? Was that pretty
good?
Exactly.
It was all planned.
It was all planned, every bit. So I have had a lot of trouble trying to connect with this, so I missed a lot of your introduction, Jenny. I heard your whole piece and I loved it. And of course, I missed what just happened just now, the Q&A, but so ignore me if you've already talked about this and we'll go to the next thing. But I was really curious about that line in your piece about Solange and about how you might have destroyed a friendship. You made this like really dramatic reference. And if you haven't already talked about that, and if it's not too much of a spoiler, could you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. So Petronella, when she left Finland, when she was deported, she was kind of hounded by the press. The press was really tough on her in what they published. There were some accusations of being a spy. There was, she was a woman really going outside of what women did in that time. And so she was like a really bright figure. And so she was pursued by the press for a while afterwards, and she went into hiding. She had a very proper Dutch family and who were kind of scandalized by the whole thing. And so out of respect for her family, she just kind of dropped off the face of the earth. And her daughter, Solange, kind of inherited that secrecy. And so when I was first in Helsinki, I met with a reporter at one of at the biggest newspaper in Helsinki, the Helsingin Sanomat. And he asked for Solange's contact information, which I obviously couldn't give him because I wouldn't want to betray her privacy, but he was going to California for an investigative journals conference, and he showed up at her house and interrogated her about the questions that her mother left behind. And so that was kind of precipitated by my journey and by my trek. And so Solange wrote and was just like, I don't know if I can still come over. And so by the time I had arrived there, there was this really wonderful idea and this momentum behind bringing Petronella home and kind of giving part of her back to these people who loved her so and have kept loving her for the next 60 years, 65 years. And that when when the reporter came and Solange wasn't sure she would come, it kind of threw that all into jeopardy.
Yeah. All right, well, I'll wait to read the book to find out more about that part of it. It was a wonderful reading. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I wanted to point out how different the readings were. I mean, we have this, what I love about Local Writers Read is that we either sort of manage to have kind of a quilt of pieces that seem sort of different on the surface, but then kind of come together and make this unified story. Or we do what we did tonight, which is to have two things that are polar opposites, which is great because one just kind of hits all these pieces in you, and then and the other one's like, oh wait, what about all this stuff? Let me nail all of those. So it was really nice to hear such two different pieces. I really enjoyed them. Thanks, you guys. Courtney, you should jump in, lady.
Okay, so I want to thank you, Jenny. That was the first I've ever heard of Petronella, and I'm fascinated, and I'm going to immediately Google everything I can, but also I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I wanted to ask you, when you met Petronella accidentally, was that the first you had ever heard of her as well, or did you already know some of the story or history?
Yes, I didn't know anything. She was my friend's mother, and so I met her that evening, and I think I went home that night. I was, what struck me immediately was that kind of feeling where you're just like, I have to go do that. There's something here. But I went home that night and I Googled her, looked her up on Wikipedia, and was just like, okay, she's on Wikipedia. That means it's true. I did not do a good job of researching who I was following before I went, because I was so taken by her story. But yeah, I've kind of found out along the way. I knew what I could from what existed in English, and from I met her another time, and we just she was really old. She was 89, and between her and Solange, we kind of pieced together the story. But there were a whole bunch of other resources in Finnish that I did not have access to, and so it wasn't until I arrived in Helsinki and stayed at the house of a friend who helped me translate some of these resources that I realized that she actually hadn't walked across Finland, that she had taken a ride to a bus and then walked into the gold fields. But I learned a lot more as I went, and kind of part of my trip to Finland was trying to find out who she was as well in the public realm. I knew what I knew of her, which was powerful but little. And so yeah, no, I didn't know her at all before that.
Thank you.
I have a question for Josh. Did I interrupt you, Courtney? Were you gonna ask something? Nope. Okay. I had a question for Josh, but I can wait. And this is great. And then Josh, if there's some things on Facebook that you wanted to get to, I can wait and ask you my question after that.
Well, you can ask yours, because I believe I know which direction you're going, and I think it ties into one of the ones on Facebook. So if you want to ask, okay, I'll string those together. Okay.
Yeah. So this what we were talking about before about characters and genre differences, because I don't really know the fantasy genre very well, and I sort of expect, there are always these really, epic battles between, the forces of good and evil at the core of these stories. And I know a little bit about your manuscript, so I suspect there might be something going on like that. But I always think that there are going to be these like really archetypal characters that come up. And I was really delighted in your piece right away when you introduced the assassin Nix, there's like this little hint that he's not going to be 100% dark as a character, because you say something about, he has some kind of relationship with these assassins, and he makes some kind of comment or thinks to himself, oh, has Eli really overstepped this time? Am I going to get a chance to take it to this guy? And the suggestion is that if Eli hasn't genuinely overstepped, then he's not probably going to execute him, right? So that tells you that this is a little bit more of a complicated character, and maybe he has some kind of honor and integrity. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about like what when you're writing these things, like, and you are headed for sort of some epic cataclysms. Like, how do you think about these characters, and what's important to you as far as creating them? Like, do you want all of them to have nuances and have these divisions in them, or how do you think about all that when you're writing in a genre like that?
Yeah. And that does tie in well. Jefferson had a question similar. He was asking about the process for writing the novella. What was the initial inspiration? And really, those kind of go hand in hand for this one. So prior to this novella, I was writing a series of linked post-apocalyptic short stories. And they're stories that I'm very happy with. The collection itself is ongoing. But I got to the end of writing, I forget how many, 12 of these stories of like the end of the world and people clinging to survival. And I finished the last one and I was like, I need to write something happy. Because just going to that emotional place with those stories took a lot, because I was in there for quite a while. And so I was thinking about like, what is something happy I want to do? I was like, well, unicorns are fun. I love adventure fantasy. And so it was just the kind of genre of like adventure and heists and like banter and all that stuff was something that I really just kind of wanted to take some time and play with. And so that was really the initial inspiration. To be entirely honest, I don't remember like what set off the genesis of the story itself. Like I remember texting a friend about it and being like, hey, I want to write like a unicorn novella, but I forget what began it. But Claire, to your question, one of the things I love playing with in writing is tropes and archetypes and kind of familiar pieces. And so partly in this, it's a very familiar setup. It's a team that's on the run that has to take a job in order to survive, and then they get in over their heads. So that's something like we're all familiar with. But with Eli in particular, I wanted to play with this idea of a warrior who is tired of violence. And Eli's entire character, like he would love to just kind of sit down and tell stories and hang out with people, but he's been trained as a soldier, and like the way he knows to survive in this world is kind of fighting. And so he's torn between trying to use what he knows how to do for good versus trying to find a place where he actually feels happy. And alongside him is Sasha, who is perfectly happy to go out and get into a fight because she's a battle unicorn. She's got the attitude to like face anything that life throws at her, but also this really kind of intense loyalty, offset by Nix, who is much less nice of a person, but living a similar life to Eli. He has a very strict code of his own. It just looks very different. And so I'm so fascinated by character that was setting up kind of very different motivations for each of the people in this story and the other characters that they end up encountering, and really kind of just setting them alongside each other and at odds with each other, and then letting this adventure just run, while at the same time just having fun with it. Like you said, I wanted those action scenes. I wanted weird swamp monsters and mystery and all just kind of the fun stuff. But really having very human characters at the center of it.
Yeah, you don't want to settle for the ordinary character, the one-dimensional character.
Exactly. And really kind of taking things that you see, elements that you see over and over again in stories like these,
Yeah.
and stories that I love, but kind of turning them sideways and being like, how else could this play out potentially?
Yeah, that's great.
Jenny, I will pull another question from Facebook. Jefferson is passing on a question from his wife, who is wondering, how much of yourself do you decide to put into the text? As in, what degree is the story about what you're seeing versus about how you personally are seeing it?
That's a great question. So something that is integral to creative nonfiction in particular, I would say all genres, but especially creative nonfiction, because you're telling true stories, is voice. And that a writer's voice is the way that they filter in their experiences and kind of take in everything that they're seeing, and it gets filtered in with all of their life experiences and the things that have happened to them before. So the smell of a river might mean something different to me than it would to you. And so I would say that most of my writing has been filtered through me. That's what makes it creative nonfiction. Like it's dreams and it's thoughts and it's things as I'm seeing them. The historical parts of my book, so the factual segments, well, it's all factual, but the parts that are about like the gold fields, for example, the history of the gold fields, or the history of Petronella's journey as told through these resources in Finland, that is all kind of straighter reporting, if that makes sense. So the resources that already exist, or the information, the historical information that already exists, is more straight reporting, and then the actual journey, the lived journey, is through my eyes, as in a more narrative sense.
Great. So we only have a few more minutes. Want to go ahead and wrap it up. And Courtney, I feel like I interrupted you by accident earlier, so if you wanted to.
I did have a question for Josh. I am like Claire, I'm not as familiar with the fantasy genre, so I don't know how unicorns are typically portrayed, but I've been lucky enough to hear about Sasha in different sections of your story through different installments of Local Writers Read last season. And I love that she's a sassy unicorn. And I'm wondering, because my sense of unicorns in the past has always been like magical and dreamy and very fairy tale like. So I'm wondering if your Sasha is sort of more typical in fantasy novels, or if you made her that way, if that's your thing, and how she came about that way.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Largely, unicorns are considered these very kind of pure beings in fantasy, where either they're very kind of, I won't say helpless, but they kind of exist apart very often. Or I've seen versions where they are kind of powerful defenders of their area that are opposed to evil. But they're always very, I think they carry a lot of symbolic connotations, which is largely how I see it. And then, so someone else that we got, Jenny and I went to school with, Katie Brisky, wrote a story which flipped unicorns very much on their head. And she wrote this incredible story about unicorns as kind of evil. And it was very much looking at the narrative of like innocent women being sacrificed to unicorns, which is something that kind of turns up over and again. And so she took a very kind of feminist analysis of unicorn imagery and women in fantasy. And so I had that vision, and then I had kind of the traditional vision. And going back to Claire's question about tropes and playing with both of those, I just kind of wanted to flip the whole thing in a different direction. So she's a black unicorn. She's a battle unicorn. She's all attitude. There's nothing dainty and delicate about her, but at the same time, she is very much a protector. And so it's kind of looking at, I mean, females in fantasy all very often fall into kind of stereotypes, and so I kind of wanted to push against that, where it's there can be kind of that kindness and that gentleness at the same time as there can be attitude, and just like to have that nuance. And so it's kind of taking a lot of those different pieces and just reconfiguring them into a new way.
Yeah.
And then she kind of emerged out of that as the process went on.
Very nice.
Yeah, I will presume to speak for women everywhere, and thank you for that.
Yes.
For pushing against those stereotypes. That's great.
Absolutely.
And so yeah, we'll wrap up in a moment. There is one more question I want to get to because I think it feels quite relevant.
All right.
And Jenny, it's for both of us, but I'll let you take it first. So Kate is wondering, has writing felt different, felt like a different process for you over the past few months with everything going on?
That's a great question. For me, well, it's when the pandemic hit, it was chaos. And for a while there was, I was feeling a lot of like fear, and it was kind of sinking in what was happening. And so I didn't write nearly at all during that time. And then everything closed down. Like I had nowhere to be. I had nothing to, well, I had some things, I actually had a lot to do. But I was able to tap into some of the, I was able to tap into my writing in a different way, I think in a deeper way, because I didn't have as many distractions. And I will say separately from the book, something I have been thinking a lot about is writing toward that fear instead of writing to escape it. And so just in general, there came a point where I felt like I could turn toward it a little bit more and like actually look at it and examine it and be like, what is it exactly that I'm afraid of? Like, what parts of mortality am I afraid of? And so that was actually really helpful for my personal process in processing the pandemic. And in the last few weeks, I have to say that I'm still writing. Right now I'm working on a book proposal with my agent that we're then hoping to sell later. But I publicly, I have not been like promoting myself as much as a writer or sharing as much of my work, because I feel like there are other voices that need to be amplified more than mine right now in this moment, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think I fall very similar. When the pandemic first hit, it was very much up and down for me. Like there were days where I would sit down and be really creative. And then there were days when everything would kind of come in and I would just stare at the computer and do nothing for a while. And then that kind of settled in. And then we hit the surge in the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think, Jenny, similar to what you're saying, there were other things to focus on. So I was kind of engaging in that conversation, trying to amplify other voices rather than spending a lot of time on my own. So just for me, through all of this, it's been a very kind of back and forth process, just depending on the day and kind of how I was feeling. But for me, writing is kind of therapeutic almost, where I don't, being a fantasy author, I don't write about my own life really, but I'm still able to kind of pour a lot of the emotions and things I'm thinking about into fiction just through the lens of other people. And so writing is always kind of that outlet for me as well, through all of this and just in general as things go on.
Yeah, writing keeps me sane. So,
yes.
Which explains a lot about what's going on in my head right now, because I haven't been writing that much lately. But yeah, when times are tough, writing saves me.
So we'll wrap up. It's right about 7. But just real quick, Courtney, did you want to have any closing thoughts or?
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Josh, for reading tonight. That was fantastic. I'm so glad that this could happen online, if not in my shop. It was great hearing you for the first time, Jenny, and Josh, as usual. It was lovely hearing more of your story. I can't wait to read all of it later this year.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you guys. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful start to our 2020 Local Writers Read virtual season.
Mhm.
Yes.
Thank you so
Yay.
much for having me.
Thank
And
you,
thank
Jenny.
you, Josh, for your great stories.
Okay, so we'll wrap up, but tune in tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Claire, Jefferson Nowicki, and Lisa Mayer will be reading further on the theme of dramatic entrances. And then after this weekend is finished, we will have all of these videos posted to our website, to Facebook, to YouTube. So feel free to go back and watch them, share them with anyone that you like. And we will be back next month with our next event as well. So we hope to hear from you. And thank you so much for tuning in tonight. It's a delight to be able to do this.
Yay.
Yeah,
All right,
thank
good,
you.
good night, everybody.
Thank you all.